I thought she would cry. I thought she would beg. I thought she would break. Instead, she smiled. And that smile would haunt Ethan Park for the rest of his life. The rain fell steadily against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Park estate, turning the Chicago skyline into a blur of silver lights and shadows. Inside the mansion, everything looked perfect. The marble floors gleamed beneath warm chandeliers. A fire crackled softly in the living room. Expensive artwork lined the walls. It was the kind of place people imagined when they thought of power. But on that particular night, something inside those walls quietly shattered. Naomi Carter stood in the hallway outside Ethan Park's private study, a folded stack of freshly pressed dress shirts resting in her arms. She had worked in this house for almost 6 years, long enough to know which floorboards creaked, long enough to know when Noah, Ethan's 8-year-old son, was having a bad dream before he even called out, long enough to recognize the difference between silence and secrets. The study door was slightly open. A narrow line of golden light spilled into the hallway. Naomi never listened to private conversations. She never asked questions. It was one of the reasons she had survived in Ethan Park's world for so long. But as she approached the door, she heard her own name. Her footsteps stopped. Inside, Ethan leaned casually against his desk, his suit jacket draped over a chair. Across from him sat a woman Naomi had never seen before. The woman laughed nervously as she twirled a glass between her fingers. "What about Naomi?" she asked. "Doesn't she know?" Ethan let out a quiet chuckle. "She knows enough." Naomi felt her stomach tighten. The woman looked uncertain. "And if she finds out everything?" Ethan shrugged. The movement was effortless, indifferent, like the answer didn't matter. "I cheated," he said. "So what?" For a moment, the entire world seemed to go still. Even the rain felt quieter. Naomi stood frozen in the hallway, not because she was surprised. Deep down, she had suspected something for months. The late-night meetings, the unexplained absences, the distant look in Ethan's eyes whenever Noah talked about family. No, what shocked her wasn't the betrayal. It was the arrogance, the complete absence of regret. Ethan Park, one of the most powerful men in the city, believed there would be no consequences, because there never had been before. The study door opened suddenly. Ethan stepped into the hallway and stopped when he saw her standing there. For the first time all evening, genuine surprise crossed his face. Naomi looked directly at him. Neither of them spoke. The rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere upstairs, a grandfather clock chimed 10 times. Ethan's expression hardened. "How long have you been standing there?" he asked. Naomi stared at him for several seconds. Then something unexpected happened. She smiled. Not a bitter smile. Not an angry smile. A calm smile. Peaceful. Almost relieved. Ethan frowned immediately. He had expected tears. Questions. Accusations. Anything but that. "Naomi," he said, but she simply nodded once. "Thank you," she replied quietly. The smile never left her face. "For finally telling me who you really are." Then she turned and walked away. And for the first time in many years, Ethan Park felt something he could not control. Fear. The next morning, the Park estate looked exactly the same. Sunlight spilled across the marble floors. Fresh flowers stood in crystal vases. The kitchen staff moved quietly through their routines. To anyone looking from the outside, nothing had changed. But houses remembered the people who held them together, and every room in the mansion carried traces of Naomi Carter. Long before the expensive artwork had arrived, before the renovations, before Ethan Park became one of the most influential men in Chicago, Naomi had already been there. She arrived 6 years earlier on a cold November afternoon carrying a single suitcase and a recommendation letter folded neatly inside her purse. She was 28 years old then, recently relocated from Atlanta, determined to build a better life for herself and her younger brother. The job was supposed to be temporary, a year at most, yet somehow the years slipped by. At first, she was simply another employee. She cleaned guest rooms, organized closets, and stayed out of everyone's way. But little by little, she became something else. When Ethan's mother became ill, Naomi was the one who sat beside her during long afternoons, reading novels aloud while sunlight drifted across the room. When Noah was born, Naomi was the one who learned exactly how warm his bottle needed to be and which lullaby helped him fall asleep during thunderstorms. She remembered birthdays. She remembered allergies. She remembered the names of teachers, doctors, neighbors, and friends. The mansion ran smoothly because Naomi noticed the details nobody else saw. Yet she never asked for recognition. That was not who she was. Upstairs, Noah sat alone at the breakfast table pushing scrambled eggs around his plate. The 8-year-old usually filled the room with questions before 7 o'clock. This morning he barely spoke. His dark eyes kept drifting toward the doorway. Waiting. Hoping. Finally, he looked up at the housekeeper. "Where is Naomi?" he asked. The woman hesitated. "She is resting this morning." Noah frowned. "She never misses breakfast." Ethan entered moments later, dressed in a charcoal suit, every inch the confident businessman the world admired. Yet even he looked tired. He poured himself coffee and opened his phone. Noah watched him carefully. "Did you make Naomi sad?" The question landed harder than Ethan expected. "Why would you ask that?" Ethan replied. Noah shrugged. "Because she looked different last night." Children often notice things adults ignored. Ethan stared into his coffee cup, but said nothing. Across town, Naomi sat alone in a small apartment overlooking a quiet street lined with maple trees. The morning light painted soft patterns across the hardwood floor. For the first time in years, there was no schedule waiting for her. No laundry to organize. No appointments to remember. No emergencies to solve. A folder rested on the kitchen table beside her. Inside were documents she had spent months preparing. Naomi looked at them, then glanced toward the window. Her smile returned, calm and steady. The same smile that had unsettled Ethan the night before. Because while everyone in the Park family believed they understood Naomi Carter, none of them knew the decision she had already made weeks ago. And none of them were prepared for what would happen when she finally walked away. For most of his life, Ethan Park had never been forced to wonder whether people would stay. They always did. Business partners stayed because of opportunity. Employees stayed because of the paycheck. Friends stayed because of influence. Even people who disliked him usually stayed close enough to benefit from his success. That certainty had become part of who he was. By 40 years old, Ethan had built a reputation that stretched far beyond Chicago. His name opened doors. His signature closed deals. When problems appeared, money solved them. When obstacles emerged, connections removed them. It was a system that had worked for years. Which was why Naomi's reaction made no sense. Throughout the day, Ethan found himself replaying the moment in the hallway. Not the conversation. Not the discovery. The smile. It lingered in his thoughts during meetings. It followed him through phone calls. It waited for him in every quiet moment. By late afternoon, irritation had replaced confusion. He sat behind the massive walnut desk in his office overlooking downtown Chicago. The skyline stretched for miles beneath a gray spring sky. His assistant stood across from him reviewing schedules. Ethan barely listened. His attention drifted toward a framed photograph sitting near the corner of the desk. Noah at age 5, Naomi beside him, both smiling after a school science fair. The picture had been there for years. Ethan had stopped noticing it long ago. Until now. "Move the charity dinner to Thursday," he said absent-mindedly. "Thursday is already booked," the assistant replied. Ethan frowned. "Then move whatever is there." The assistant blinked. "It is Noah's school event." Silence followed. Ethan rarely forgot details involving business. Yet lately he seemed to be forgetting details involving his own son. After the assistant left, Ethan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. The office suddenly felt unusually quiet. He remembered a conversation from years earlier. Noah had been 3 years old and refused to sleep unless Naomi read him a story. Ethan had laughed about it at the time. Another small household problem Naomi effortlessly solved. Looking back, there had been hundreds of moments like that. Small things. Invisible things. The kind nobody appreciated because they always happened exactly when needed. His phone buzzed. A message from the house manager appeared. Naomi requested a meeting tomorrow morning. Attached was a formal letter. Ethan opened it. His eyes narrowed immediately. It was a resignation notice. Effective immediately. He stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he laughed quietly. The sound held no amusement. Naomi was emotional. Hurt. She needed time. That was all. People said dramatic things when they were upset. They always came back after reality settled in. Ethan placed the phone face down and stood beside the window. Far below, thousands of people moved through the city. Every one of them replaceable. Every position filled by someone else. That was how the world worked. Yet, deep inside, a question surfaced that he refused to acknowledge. If Naomi was so easy to replace, Why had the thought of her leaving followed him all day? Ethan pushed the question aside. By tomorrow, everything would return to normal. Naomi would calm down. The house would continue running. Life would move forward exactly as it always had. Confident in that belief, he turned away from the window. He did not notice that for the first time in years, certainty was beginning to crack. The following morning arrived with the kind of bright spring sunshine that made everything appear simpler than it really was. Ethan Park entered the estate's breakfast room expecting routine to restore itself. Routine always did. Problems faded. Emotions settled. People adjusted. That was how life had worked for him for years. Yet the moment he stepped inside, he sensed something was different. Noah sat quietly at the table, staring at a bowl of cereal that had long since gone soggy. Usually the boy filled the room with questions about school, basketball, or whatever book had captured his attention that week. Today he barely looked up. Ethan took his seat and reached for a cup of coffee. "Good morning," he said. Noah nodded without enthusiasm. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. "Where is Naomi?" Noah asked immediately. Ethan paused. The question landed with surprising force. "She is busy," he replied. Noah frowned. "She always comes to say goodbye before school." Ethan offered no answer. Across the room, several staff members exchanged brief glances before looking away. It was a small moment, almost invisible, but Ethan noticed it. For the first time, he became aware of how many things inside the house revolved around Naomi. The flowers on the table had always appeared fresh. Noah's school forms had always been completed on time. His mother's medical appointments years earlier had always been organized. Holiday decorations had always appeared exactly when they should. Somehow every detail had managed itself, or so he had believed. His phone buzzed. A reminder for Naomi's scheduled meeting. 10 o'clock sharp. Ethan glanced at the clock. 9:53. 7 minutes later, Naomi entered his office carrying the same calm expression she had worn the night before. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, outlining her silhouette against the city skyline. She looked rested, peaceful. Ethan disliked how much that bothered him. Most people entering his office appeared nervous. Naomi looked free. She placed a folder on the desk. "My resignation paperwork," she said gently. Ethan did not touch it. "You are overreacting." Naomi simply looked at him. "Am I?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. 6 years, Naomi. You are going to throw all of that away because you are upset." Her expression never changed. "That is not why I am leaving." "Then explain it to me." A faint smile touched her face again. The same smile. The one that had refused to leave his thoughts. "You still think this started yesterday?" Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" Naomi glanced toward the city beyond the glass. For a moment, she seemed to be looking at a future only she could see. "I made this decision weeks ago." The words hit harder than Ethan expected. Weeks ago, before the conversation, before the confrontation, before anything he believed had triggered her departure. Suddenly a possibility emerged that he had never considered. What if her leaving was not an emotional reaction? What if she had already outgrown the life he assumed she would always accept? For the first time, uncertainty crept into Ethan's voice. "Where will you go?" Naomi met his eyes. "Somewhere I am not invisible." And as the silence settled between them, Ethan felt the first unmistakable crack in the world he thought he controlled. Naomi left the estate carrying only a leather tote bag and a small cardboard box. No dramatic farewell. No angry words. No attempt to make anyone feel guilty. The front doors closed behind her with a quiet click, and somehow that simple sound echoed through the mansion more loudly than any argument could have. By noon, the absence had already become noticeable. A delivery arrived with no instructions attached. The florist called asking about an annual charity event, and nobody knew the answer. The chef discovered that several important dietary notes for upcoming guests had never been entered into the digital system because Naomi had always remembered them herself. Small problems began appearing everywhere. Individually, they seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern. Ethan noticed it by late afternoon. The house felt less organized, less alive, as if an invisible thread holding everything together had quietly disappeared. Meanwhile, across the city, Naomi stepped into a modern brick building overlooking Lake Michigan. The structure was not as large as the Park estate. It did not have chandeliers or marble floors. Yet the moment she entered, something inside her relaxed. A receptionist greeted her with a smile. "Miss Carter, everyone is excited to meet you." Naomi smiled back. She followed the woman through bright hallways filled with sunlight and framed photographs. Children appeared in many of the pictures. Families, too. Moments later, she entered a conference room where several executives stood waiting. Their expressions were warm, respectful. One of them extended his hand immediately. "Welcome aboard, Director Carter." Naomi accepted the handshake. The title still felt unfamiliar. 6 months earlier, she would never have imagined hearing those words. The executive opened a presentation folder. "The community foundation has been growing quickly. We need someone with leadership, organization, and compassion. After reviewing your recommendations, there was no doubt you were the right person." Naomi listened quietly. Recommendations. The word made her think of all the letters hidden inside the folder she had carried home for years. Letters from doctors, teachers, community leaders, even Ethan's late mother. People who had noticed her contributions long before Ethan ever did. Back at the estate, Ethan sat alone in his office staring at the resignation paperwork. Something bothered him. He reached for his phone and called the private investigator his company occasionally used for background checks. "I need information," he said. "On Naomi Carter." The investigator sounded surprised. "What kind of information?" Ethan hesitated. He realized he knew remarkably little about a woman who had spent 6 years in his home. Everything. 2 days later, a thick report arrived on his desk. Ethan opened it casually. Within minutes, his expression changed. Naomi held a degree in nonprofit management. She had graduated with honors. She served on community boards. She volunteered at youth programs. She had received leadership awards he had never heard about. Ethan turned page after page in stunned silence. The woman he viewed as part of the background had built an entire life beyond his walls. A life filled with accomplishments, goals, and opportunities. Then he reached the final section. There, attached to the report, was an acceptance letter dated nearly a month earlier. Naomi had secured her new position weeks before their confrontation. Weeks before, the realization struck harder than he expected. She had not left because of one conversation. She had not left because she was emotional. She had left because she had finally chosen herself. And for the first time, Ethan Park began to understand that he had never truly known the woman whose absence now filled every room of his house. The report stayed on Ethan's desk long after everyone else had gone home. Outside, the city lights shimmered across Lake Michigan, but he barely noticed them. For the first time in years, work failed to distract him. Every page he had read revealed another piece of Naomi's life that existed completely independent of him. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. 3 days after Naomi left, the Park estate no longer felt like the same home. The changes were subtle at first. Noah forgot his science project at school because nobody remembered to place it by the front door the night before. A parent-teacher conference was accidentally scheduled over an important business meeting. The refrigerator contained groceries nobody planned to cook. Flowers wilted in vases because nobody replaced them. Small details, tiny inconveniences. Yet each one seemed to point toward the same uncomfortable truth. Naomi had never simply worked there. She had quietly carried responsibilities nobody else noticed. The biggest change, however, was Noah. The boy became quieter with each passing day. One evening, Ethan found him sitting alone in the library, staring at a framed photograph from several years earlier. It showed Noah, missing his 2 front teeth, holding a trophy almost bigger than his torso. Naomi stood beside him, laughing. Ethan sat down across from him. "You miss her?" Noah nodded. "She always came to my games." Ethan swallowed. "I came to your games too." Noah looked down at the photograph. "Sometimes." The answer was not cruel. It was honest. Somehow that made it worse. Later that night, Ethan walked through the silent mansion. The polished hallways reflected soft golden light from wall sconces. Every room looked perfect, yet the house felt strangely empty. He stopped outside the kitchen and remembered dozens of moments he had ignored over the years. Naomi helping Noah study spelling words at the counter. Naomi teaching him how to make pancakes on Saturday mornings. Naomi sitting beside his mother during difficult treatments, holding her hand while pretending not to notice the fear in her eyes. Memories surfaced one after another, none of them dramatic, none of them grand. Yet together they formed something impossible to overlook. Naomi had been the emotional center of the household. She had protected its warmth while everyone else took it for granted. The following week brought another surprise. Ethan attended a fundraising gala where several influential community leaders gathered. During a conversation, one of them mentioned Naomi's name. "Director Carter is remarkable," the woman said warmly. "Our youth mentorship program has already doubled participation since she arrived." Ethan blinked. Another executive joined the discussion. Then another. One after another, successful people spoke about Naomi with admiration and respect. Listening from the edge of the conversation, Ethan felt a strange sensation growing inside him. It was not jealousy. It was regret. These people knew parts of Naomi he had never bothered to learn. They understood her dreams, her accomplishments, her leadership. Meanwhile, after 6 years under the same roof, he had barely known her at all. Driving home that night, Ethan finally confronted a truth he had been avoiding. He had spent years believing Naomi needed the Park family. But perhaps the opposite had been true. Perhaps they had needed her far more than she ever needed them. And as the realization settled over him, Ethan understood that losing her was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a loss that no amount of money, influence, or success could easily replace. 2 weeks passed, yet the feeling refused to leave. Ethan found himself noticing Naomi's absence in places he never expected. It was not just the house anymore. It was his life. One rainy Thursday afternoon, he sat alone in his office reviewing old financial records when a particular expense report caught his attention. The document had been filed 3 years earlier. Normally, he would have ignored it. Instead, a handwritten note attached to the corner made him stop. The handwriting was Naomi's. It explained why a scholarship payment had been approved for an employee's daughter after a family emergency. Ethan frowned. He vaguely remembered authorizing the funds. What he did not remember was learning that Naomi had personally contributed half the amount herself. Curious, he opened more archived files. Then another, and another. What began as a simple search quickly became something else entirely. Over the next several hours, Ethan uncovered a pattern hidden beneath years of paperwork. Whenever a staff member faced hardship, Naomi quietly stepped forward. When a groundskeeper's wife required medical treatment, Naomi organized support. When a cook's son needed tutoring, Naomi found volunteers. When Noah's elementary school struggled to fund a reading program, Naomi donated anonymously. Again and again, her name appeared in places nobody thought to look. Yet she never asked for recognition, never mentioned it, never used it to gain influence. Ethan leaned back in his chair, stunned. The deeper he searched, the worse he felt. Then he discovered something that left him speechless. Buried among old correspondence was a letter from his late mother. The envelope had never been opened because it was addressed to Naomi. Somehow it had remained archived with household records after her passing. Ethan stared at it for several seconds before carefully reading a scanned copy attached by the estate attorney years earlier. The words were simple. His mother thanked Naomi for her kindness, her loyalty, and the comfort she had provided during difficult days. But one sentence struck Ethan harder than anything else. "You see people when others only see roles." Ethan read the line 3 times. Slowly, memories resurfaced. Naomi remembering birthdays. Naomi staying late at the hospital. Naomi sitting through school concerts. Naomi listening when people needed encouragement. She had spent years seeing everyone around her. Meanwhile, Ethan realized with growing shame that he had rarely done the same for her. That evening, another discovery arrived unexpectedly. Noah walked into the study carrying a worn notebook. "I found this in my room," he said. Inside were dozens of notes Naomi had written over the years. Encouraging messages before exams. Reminders that mistakes were part of learning. Little jokes designed to make him smile. One page contained a sentence written in careful handwriting. "The strongest people are the ones who help others without needing applause." Noah looked up. "She used to leave these everywhere." Ethan swallowed hard. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Then Noah asked the question Ethan had secretly been asking himself for days. "Why did we never notice how much she did?" The room fell silent. Because for the first time, Ethan understood the secret nobody had known. Naomi had spent years quietly making other people's lives better while asking for almost nothing in return. And now that she was gone, the true size of her absence could finally be seen. 3 weeks after Naomi left the Park estate, Ethan finally stopped pretending he could fix the situation with a simple apology. At first, he told himself that time would solve everything. People moved on. Emotions faded. Life adjusted. But the longer Naomi remained gone, the more obvious the truth became. Nothing was returning to the way it had been. One Saturday morning, Ethan drove across the city toward the community foundation where Naomi now worked. The building stood near a public park filled with children playing basketball and families enjoying the warm spring weather. It was a different world from the private clubs and luxury offices he usually visited. As he stepped inside, he immediately noticed something unusual. People smiled when they saw Naomi. Not because they had to. Not because she held authority over them. They smiled because they genuinely respected her. Through a glass conference room wall, Ethan watched her speaking with a group of volunteers. She looked confident, comfortable, alive in a way he had never fully seen before. There was no trace of the woman who used to quietly disappear into the background of his household. Here, she was leading, guiding, inspiring. For a moment, Ethan simply stood there. The realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Naomi had not lost anything when she left. She had gained the freedom to become everything she was meant to be. When the meeting ended, she noticed him immediately. Their eyes met across the room. Neither looked away. Several minutes later, they sat together at a small table overlooking the park. Children laughed outside. Trees swayed gently in the breeze. The setting felt strangely peaceful. Ethan cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." Naomi listened quietly. "For many things," he continued. "For taking you for granted. For not seeing you. For assuming you would always stay." Naomi folded her hands together. "I appreciate that." Ethan looked down briefly. "I was wrong." The words felt unfamiliar. He rarely spoke them. Naomi nodded gently. "Yes, you were." There was no anger in her voice. No satisfaction. Just honesty. Somehow that made the moment even harder. Ethan glanced toward the window. "Noah misses you." A softness appeared in Naomi's eyes. "I miss him too." "Then come back," Ethan said. "Not as staff. Not as an employee. We can figure something out." The moment the words left his mouth, he already knew the answer. Naomi smiled. The same calm smile that had haunted him for weeks. "Ethan, I already have a life here." He looked around the building. Around the people who greeted her by name. Around the future she had built for herself. Slowly, painfully, he understood. This was never a story about convincing Naomi to return. It was about accepting that she had moved forward. The hardest lesson of all was realizing that some opportunities only exist once. Ethan had spent years believing she would always be there whenever he decided to notice her value. But life did not work that way. Some people leave quietly. Some doors close gently. And by the time you understand what they meant to you, they are already walking toward a future that no longer includes you. 6 months later, autumn arrived in Chicago carrying crisp air and golden leaves that drifted across sidewalks and city parks. Life had moved forward, just as it always did. The community foundation continued to grow under Naomi's leadership. New programs opened. More families received support. More children discovered opportunities that once seemed impossible. Her days were full, meaningful, and entirely her own. Across the city, the park estate remained beautiful. The marble floors still shined. The gardens remained perfectly maintained. Business continued to thrive. From the outside, Ethan Park appeared as successful as ever. Yet success felt different now. Quieter. Less certain. One afternoon, Ethan sat in the front row of Noah's school leadership ceremony. Parents filled the auditorium. Teachers smiled proudly from the sides of the stage. When Noah's name was called, the boy confidently walked forward to receive an award for community service and mentorship. Ethan applauded with everyone else. Then he noticed something written beneath Noah's acceptance speech. A familiar name. When Noah stepped to the microphone, his voice carried clearly through the room. "I learned that helping people matters more than impressing them. I learned that the strongest people are kind even when nobody is watching. And I learned that from Naomi Carter." The room erupted in applause. Ethan felt his throat tighten. After the ceremony ended, he remained seated while families gathered around the students. He looked toward the back of the auditorium and saw Naomi standing near the exit. She had attended quietly, never seeking attention. Noah spotted her immediately and ran over with a smile. Ethan watched them talk and laugh together. For the first time, there was no jealousy in his heart. No desire to reclaim what had been lost. Only gratitude. Later that evening, as the sun disappeared behind the skyline, Ethan stood alone on the terrace of the estate. The city stretched endlessly before him. In his hand was the photograph from Noah's old science fair. The same photograph he had once ignored sitting on his desk. He studied it for a long time. Then he placed it carefully inside a frame in the center of his study where everyone could see it. Not because Naomi belonged to his story, but because she had changed it. Some lessons arrive through success. Others arrive through loss. Ethan had spent years believing power meant control. He believed money could solve problems. Influence could open doors. Status could command loyalty. What he finally learned was far simpler. Respect could not be demanded. Love could not be assumed. And people could never be treated as permanent fixtures in someone else's life. The most valuable things were often the easiest to overlook until they were gone. Somewhere across the city, Naomi was building a future she had earned through courage, dignity, and self-respect. Ethan smiled faintly as he looked out at the lights below. The memory of her calm smile no longer haunted him. Now it taught him, because on the night he thought he had all the power, Naomi had quietly done something far greater. She had chosen herself. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.